Temple of Solomon was built as concentric walls with the Holy of Holies in the middle. These walls were extremely thick, and they were to protect the initiate from the Ark of the Covenant. The initiate had to go through all sorts of initiation to eventually go from one wall to the other to get to the Holy of Holies. It was the largest temple ever built on earth. But during the 1st century A.D., the Philistines took over Jerusalem. There was a B plan for the ark. That B plan was called the Dead Sea community. On the side of the Dead Sea, that was the Essenes. Now, the first person that talked about the Essenes and that community was Edgar Cayce. Edgar Cayce, in one of his readings, said there was a community on the side of the Dead Sea that had written scrolls, and that we were going to find these scrolls. Now, when he said that, I think it was in the 30s, all the archaeologists said that was bunk, because there was no writing whatsoever about that society on the side of the Red Sea. There was no record of it anywhere. That was because it was the B plan for the ark. They weren't advertising. So when they took the ark out of the Temple of Solomon, they brought it to the Essenes, which was a community of high priests that was constantly being made ready in case the ark would show up. Go ahead.
James, the brother of Jesus, was with the Essenes for a long time.
Well, I think that the whole family was with the Essenes for a long time. The Essenes recorded the coming of the ark. This is not my imagination. In the Essene scrolls that were found, you know that there was over 5,000 scrolls, or at least 3,000, scrolls that were found. There's only 100 that have been released to the public. One of these that was released to the public is a very, very eccentric scroll. It's not written on papyrus. It's written on copper. The copper that it's written on is the purest copper ever found on earth. There is no purest copper ever found anywhere else. No. What does the copper scroll? Now, obviously, the copper scroll were written on copper to make sure they would survive the ages. And what did the copper scrolls talk about? It talked about the coming of the ark at the Essene community. It says literally that the ark came to their temple. And it describes where it hid all of the components that were kept around the ark. How many components do you think there was? 64. There is exactly 64 lines describing the components of the ark. Some of these components have now been found. It was oils and incense and stuff that they kept around the ark that were part of what you needed to be safe when you went into the ark room. You had to wear certain clothing. You had to cover your eyes. You had to have certain oils on your skin for the conductivity. All these things. Do you guys understand where I'm going there? Okay. If some of you read Elizabeth Heisch's book called Initiation? Note, in Elizabeth Heisch's book, when she's initiated in front of the Ark of the Covenant inside the Grand Pyramid of Giza. That book is extremely accurate. I've done a lot of research. I assure you, that book is extremely accurate. And she actually describes going towards the Ark, and she actually describes smelling negative ions in the air. So she's actually talking about the ark generating electromagnetic field and ionizing the air. Well, they have now found some of the components around the Dead Sea Scrolls of the ark. And when they did, it turned out that they found, I don't have this picture, but they found the place where the Essenes say that they hid the ark, because they had it for a fairly long time. The place where they hid the ark was a cavern across from where they lived, across from the temple. When they opened that cavern, and this is research you can find on the net. When they opened that cavern, there was a blue iridescent spot in the middle. Actually, NASA physicists that were there at the opening of that cavern, they reported that blue spot being there, and they said something really interesting. They said, this is similar to the blue spot we found inside the Mayan pyramids when we first opened them. So they were making a direct relationship between the Ark of the Covenant, the effect of the Ark of the Covenant on the space-time manifold that left some trace, and the Mayan pyramids. And so, interestingly, when the ark disappears from the temples of the Temple of Solomon and goes to the Essene, at the same period, very shortly after, the living ark, Emmanuel, appears onto the scene. Emmanuel might have been able to walk on water because he had some anti-gravitational capability in his back pocket. Go ahead.
Well, in the Book of Mormon, when Emmanuel or Jesus visits the American continent after he left Israel.
Well, then he would have had to be able to do some pretty good flying too. And so, interestingly, Emmanuel is the living ark. Well, these things are related. Why? Because when we built the external Merkabah, the external ark, all we're building is a reproduction of our internal functioning. The inside singularity, the inside ark that keeps us alive. And so we're creating a very short feedback. That's why you had to be initiated very carefully before you could approach the ark. You had to be pure of heart. Because the feedback is so short that if you have destructive intent, you'll just die right on the spot. It'll bite you right back. So Aaron's sons died that way. It's a very fail-safe system. You can't use it for destruction very much. Because by the time you try to use it for destruction, you're already dead. See, it's nothing new. The universe is a feedback. We are very destructive in nature. And we're just about to destroy ourselves. But meanwhile, it took a long time, and we had time to destroy a lot of things around us. With this, no waiting necessary. You just don't survive the experience. There is people that did try to use the ark for destruction in the pharaonic traditions. These were very, very warlike pharaohs. They were found mummified with what they thought at first was smallpox all over their body. They found out later that it wasn't smallpox at all, that it was tumors all over their skin, like they had been irradiated by radioactivity. At one point, the ark is attempted to be used for war and is taken by the Philistines before it's moved to the Essene, long before. And the same thing happens. They bring it to their temple and they try to use it and all this, and they all get tumors. It's in the Bible. And so they send it back to the Temple of Solomon. They're like, get that thing out of here. So Emmanuel was most likely born in the field of the Ark of the Covenant. And as a result, he had very advanced DNA structure. In fact, Emmanuel might have got revived by using the Ark of the Covenant and resuscitating him, generating the whole, return of Emmanuel, return of Jesus 3 days later. Well, when I was asked to talk about the Knights Templar. So you guys are seeing this view a little bit more. I'm going to tell you now how it reaches you, how far this goes, and how much the power at B is actually trying to get this power back. First of all, the key to the Bible is to understand that the Old Testament is talking about advanced technology, very, very advanced technology. The crystal, the power of the sun gods, the power of Atlantis, which was brought out of Atlantis, brought to Egypt, and eventually brought to the Temple of Solomon by Moses. And the other side of the Bible, the New Testament, is talking about the living ark, the purity of heart, the purity of intent you have to be with the ark. And it's actually when the two are put together that we have the new level of civilization. When the technology, the external technology matches our internal knowledge, and the internal knowledge match the external technology. It is not all internal, like spiritual, commonly think of. And it is not completely external, like most physicists think of. But it is both internal and external. That's the feedback. So when when the much later, it seems like there was a Jewish contingency in France that believed that they were the direct descendant of Emmanuel, the Cathars. And the Cathars, I think, was it the Cathars? Yeah, I believe so. They were looking for the Ark of the Covenant. This is a large Jewish community in the middle of France that nobody knows how they got there. There's a lot of books now being published saying that actually Emmanuel, after his crucifixion and his revival, went through India and into Europe and resettled in France. And that Cathars were truly the bloodline of Emmanuel. In any case, true or false, they believed they were. And they were looking for the ark. They might have had very ancient documents that were brought there by the groups that settled the Jewish community there. They started an order of knights to look for the ark. That order was called the Knights Templar. The first name they were given was the Knights of the Poor, because they were very poor, and their insignia was 2 knights on 1 horse, because they couldn't afford a horse for every knight. They were commissioned by a priest, a Cathar priest, to look for the ark. Well, after years of research and so on, they came to conclude that the ark had to be in Jerusalem somewhere, under the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They conjured the armies of France. Okay? They convinced them to go and take Jerusalem. And as a result, started the Crusades. This is history. The Crusades were described in the tales of the search for the Holy Grail. They couldn't talk about the Ark directly because of Inquisition. So they called it the Holy Grail. And in the first edition of that story, they call it a crystal stone. Later on, describing it as a cup, which had 2 vortices on each side. And so they went across all the countries they needed to go across to go to Jerusalem. They fought their way through all the way, generating huge amount of difficulties, and eventually got to Jerusalem and took over the ancient city of Jerusalem. This is historic. They were there and they occupied Jerusalem for many years. For 7 of those years, the Knights Templar themselves settled right beside the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and dug and dug and dug tunnels that are still there today. But because this is Islamic ground today, the temple, the mount, it's the rock of foundation is right under the dome of the rock in Jerusalem, which is Islamic, is under Islamic control. The Islamic population goes there on pilgrimage, turn around the rock where the ark used to be placed inside the Temple of Solomon. They're venerating the exact same thing as the Jewish tradition. And they're all fighting. Amazing. In any case, those tunnels are still there under the ark, under the Temple Mount. They're not accessible. You can't go there. They're blocked, and they're heavily guarded. In any case, the Knights Templar dug for 7 years and found zilch. Well, they found a lot of documents, and that's in history books, but they didn't find the ark. It just happens that while they were there digging, the king of Ethiopia was in exile. There was a revolution in Ethiopia and was brought in exile to Jerusalem. And when he heard the Knights Templars were looking for the ark, he went to them and said, I have the ark. It's in Ethiopia. Now, how did that happen? There was a very well-known route along the Nile that went down the Nile, through the Blue Nile, into Lake Taos in Ethiopia. And sure enough, in Ethiopia, you find a high population of ancient Jewish tradition, which scholars never knew where the Jews came from, why they went to Ethiopia. Most likely what happened is that the Essene temple became unstable, became dangerous. It became dangerous to leave the ark there. So they decided to take it down the Nile. They did, and they eventually settled at Elephantine Island on the Nile. And they found an Hebraic temple there, which, you know, in Jewish tradition, you're not supposed to build a temple unless it's the temple to place the ark in. So wherever you find an ancient Hebraic temple, the ark had to be there. So you find that temple in the appropriate times being built on Elephantine Island. And then it stayed there for a long time, hundreds of years, till it became unstable there too. So they brought it down into the Blue Nile, into Ethiopia. And in Ethiopia, on that lake, you find a very ancient Hebraic temple having been built. And all the priests there say that they used to have the ark. And then eventually the ark was brought to St. Mary of Zion in Axiom, Ethiopia, where it's supposed to be to this day. It's a little chapel that's heavily guarded by the Ethiopian army. And so the Knights Templar actually went down the Nile, and what they did is they made a deal with that king. That king actually is the father of the Rastafarian tradition. Wow. That's how deep this goes. The Rastafarian tradition is actually directly linked to the history of the Ark. And if you talk to Rastafarians that are really scholarly involved, they will tell you that the Ark is the center of their worship. So the Knights Templar, isn't this amazing? The Knights Templar went down the Nile with that king, and because they had the control over the European armies, said, we'll give you back your country. That's not a big problem for us. We've got guns. They have, arrows and lances. And so they went down the Nile. Actually, they didn't have quite guns at the time, but they had more advanced technology than the Africans. And they fought for that king's country, and in exchange, the king gave them access to the Ark. And there, in Ethiopia, you find ancient traditions that talk about blonde air, blue-eyed people, Europeans, coming during those years, liberating the country, and building all sorts of things. Now, when you find these things they built, you know they didn't build this with conventional means. Because when you find the things they built in Ethiopia, you find that those are churches. One of them is a church that's a big Knights Templar cross type of structure that is not built, actually it's cut into the stone, like laser cut into the stone, and then it's cut inside it and then emptied out. This huge chapel, right? Basically cut, like sculpted right out of the stone. Only one person has been able to interview the guardian of the ark today. One priest in Ethiopia is chosen to guard the ark, and he has to be pure of heart. And when he's chosen to guard the ark, he never leaves the chapel where the ark is. From that moment on, he stays there for the rest of his life. That high priest gave one interview, and he gave it to Graham Hancock, and it's in the book, The Sign and the Seal. And in the interview, Graham says, "What is the power of the ark?" And the high priest, well, first of all, he says, how was it the first time you went in front of the ark? And the high priest said, "It was terrifying." And Graham Hancock says, "Why?" And he said, "Because the ark is an object of fire. That means it radiates." And then he said, "What's the power of the ark?" And the high priest pointed across from the chapel in Ethiopia. And across from that chapel in Ethiopia are huge pillars, some of them 500 tons pillars of granite that were erected, just like Egyptian obelisks. And he said, this was not done with the power of man. This was brought here with the power of the ark. So he actually says directly to Graham Hancock that the ark has gravitational capabilities. Go ahead.
What do you think is...
Interestingly, when they arrived in Europe, the first thing they did is that they built... You see, all of a sudden they became builders. You know, out of nowhere, all of a sudden, they could build amazing structures. The first thing they built was the first Gothic cathedral, Chartres, a huge cathedral in France. Now that cathedral has been examined by many engineers, and all the engineers agree that thing is not reproducible with current technological advancements. I mean, you're talking whole temples, whole pyramids were covered with gold. You don't do that by mining in the middle of the desert. Okay? So, the ark crystal is the philosopher's stone that the alchemists were looking for. So when you start, now it starts to make a whole picture different, eh? The Knights Templar could not talk about the ark directly because the Vatican would have had their head real quick. So they had to talk about it in terms of magic, in terms of magical spell. They had all these ancient books that had description of the ark. They started to distribute those in underground, grassroots, sectors. And all these became magical texts. That's why you see all these ancient texts appearing in the middle of Europe, like the Kabbalistic texts. And the modern archaeologists and historians think, oh, the Kabbalah came out of the 11th century in Europe. It's not ancient. And all the Jewish people are saying, no, this is ancient knowledge. Right? That's because the historians are confused where the information came from. It came from the Knights Templar. And so they start to distribute this, and they became very powerful. They became very rich, and the King of France started to freak out. The King of France was losing a lot of money, and the Pope was getting very, very worried that the Ark was going to become public knowledge. And that would not be good for the Vatican. So the King of France, and this is a historic meeting, the King of France, the Pope of the time, and an Ethiopian delegation got together at the Vatican. And they all talked about it, and they decided they needed the Knights Templars out of there. Now it's no longer the 11th century, we're talking 13th century, the year 1213. On a Friday the 13th, which gave Friday the 13th this bad reputation, the Knights Templars were declared illegal. The order of the Knights Templar was declared illegal by the Pope, and the Inquisition striked at some of the largest temples of the Knights Templar. Many of the temples actually were dedicated to the goddess, to the Black Madonna. And how things work was brought through the ages, through these two enterprises, the Freemasons and the Knights Templar. And that's why in both of these traditions, you find and I did research this, they both say that their roots was the Knights Templar, and that their knowledge comes from ancient Egypt. You see what I mean? And they both have the highest level of initiation at the 32nd level of initiation. 33rd being, a complementary initiation, actually, because the 33rd is just when you get to direct a house in both of them. But the higher level of initiation in both system is the 32nd level of initiation. So the two put together generate the 64. And in both systems, the highest level of initiation consists of, and I've asked to both, consists of stepping in front of a mock Ark of the Covenant and making vows. So they still have the concept of the Ark in there. Well, when the New World was discovered, guess who came? The Freemasons. The founders of the Constitution of this country was written by Freemasons. And the whole layout of the Washington Monument and so on was laid out by the Freemasons. That's why you have a huge stellar in the middle, an Egyptian symbol. That's why the Pentagon is a pentagon. That's why the White House and all the area and all this generates a star tetrahedron. And that's why when you look at the $1 bill, you have a pyramid with an eye on it. And on the other side, if you have a $1 bill, check it out, you will see a star tetrahedron generated by 12 stars with a 13 in the middle. The vector equilibrium, the 12 vectors of the vector equilibrium generating the singularity, the 13 in the middle.